southwest England on Sunday, but they should be fizzling out. Again, plenty of sunshine for Scotland, Northern Ireland and much of northern England. Again, after a frosty start, temperatures ticking up by the afternoon into the high single figures, 7, 8, 9 Celsius. But don't forget, across the south, although a little drier in the southeast, that wind will make it feel really quite cold tomorrow.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Good morning. This is the Saturday selection here on GB News with Esther McVeigh and Philip Davis. Coming up on the first hour of the show, we're looking at every aspect of the war in Ukraine. We'll be live in the country itself, as well as assessing the scale of the refugee crisis, the impact of UK sanctions and the response from the United States. That's all to come after the very latest news headlines.
Good morning, it's 10 o'clock. I'm Olivia Guthrie in the GB newsroom. People in the Ukrainian cities of Mariupol and Volnovakha have started evacuating after Russia declared a temporary ceasefire in the two areas. The Ukrainian government says the plan is to evacuate around 200,000 people from Mariupol and 15,000 from Volnovakha, with the Red Cross acting as the ceasefire's guarantor. But Ukraine says Russian forces have focused attacks on the capital Kyiv, with loud explosions heard overnight. Prime Minister Boris Johnson says the Kremlin's actions are an abomination and the world is turning its back on Moscow.
Global corporations are severing ties with Russia. Participation in sporting events is being cancelled, and nation after nation is taking a stand. The vice is tightening its grip, and it will continue to tighten.
The Ministry of Defence says the rate of Russian air and artillery strikes in Ukraine has slowed in the last 24 hours. An intelligence briefing from the MOD reports Ukraine continues to hold on to the cities of Kharkiv, Cherniv and Mariupol. There's also been street fighting in Sumy, and authorities say it's highly likely all four cities are surrounded by Russian forces. Aid agencies are warning of a humanitarian disaster as food, water and medical supplies run short. Former NATO planner Philip Ingram told GB News Ukraine should brace itself for more aggression from Russia.
Ukrainians, a much smaller, weaker force on paper, but with a real resolve, it shows the human element of it, are holding back the Russians. In military terms, they fixed them. The Russians haven't got the ability to maneuver, and they've stopped them achieving their objectives. The trouble is, historically, when the Russians don't get their objectives, they then start to go really nasty. and we're in for the long game.
The Ukrainian president is accusing NATO of weakness after it refused to implement a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Volodymyr Zelensky says people will die because of the West's inaction. The Ukrainian leader posted a new message online this morning denying reports he's left the country.
Good evening. Every day there are rumours that I've run away from Ukraine, from Kiev or from the office. As you can see, I am here. I'm in my place and my team is also here. Nobody ran anywhere. We are working. We love jogging, but now is not a time for exercise. So we are working. Glory to Ukraine.
Тому працюємо. Слава Україні.
Well, a Formula One team has sacked its Russian driver following the country's invasion of Ukraine. Nikita Mazepin's contract has been terminated by the American-owned team Haas and say he will not race in Formula One this season. The team also ended its deal with Russian sponsor Uralkali, owned by Mr. Mazepin's father. And Britain has won its first medal in the Winter Paralympics in Beijing. Skier Millie Knight and guide Brett Wild have won bronze in the women's visually impaired downhill. This is GB News. The latest headlines in the next hour. Now back to Saturday Selection.
Thanks for joining us. This is the Saturday Selection here on GB News. I'm Esther McVeigh.
And I'm Philip Davis. Coming up, senior Tory backbencher Edward Lee joins us shortly with the Ukrainian refugee crisis becoming more of a global concern by the hour.
But first, let's go through some of the top stories of the week with the help of celebrity chef and award-winning TV presenter Kevin Woodford. Kevin, what's caught your eye this week? There is only one story.
There is one story. You know, it's horrific. And it's hard to believe that one man is capable of such evil. It really is, you know. And I sit and I watch the news and it breaks my heart because I think if it was here and there was a no-fly zone, and I understand why there isn't a no-fly zone, obviously I do at this particular stage, how would I feel, you know, with my children if there were sort of, you know, gunships flying above me, you know, helicopters, and there were bombs raining down on me, and what everybody else was doing was putting sanctions out to try and help, but nothing else. So I really do understand why we don't have, why there isn't a no-fly zone. But part of me wishes there was, to be quite frank, you know, because I think at the end of the day, we're dealing with a really dangerous guy. If you look at his latest escapade to actually to throw rockets, you know, at a nuclear plant, which is 10 times more powerful than the Chernobyl situation was. This is world devastation, you know, if we don't deal with it. There are sort of glimmers of hope, aren't there? I mean, the president of Ukraine, for goodness sake, what a guy. From a comedian, you know, to a leader like this is incredible. The Ukrainian people, I admire enormously. You know, and we've got situations, for example, I read that there's the second largest oil producer in Russia, which was founded by, obviously, one of our oligarchs, a billionaire, has actually suggested to Putin that he needs to stop this. Now, we need much more of that happening. We need to see the oligarchs really stepping up to this, and as much pressure as the West and the rest of us can place on Putin, the better. Maybe what we need is the generals to realise that it's them that's going to be in The Hague facing the war crimes.
I think President Zelensky's become an international hero, hasn't he?
Incredible.
You know, the bravery of him being offered a safe passage out of the country.
Absolutely.
Lord Ashcroft did some polling of Ukrainians, which came out yesterday, and it showed that 92% of Ukrainians had a favourable view of President Zelensky and 66% a very favourable view of him. You know, I mean, that's unbelievable for a leader of any country, isn't it?
I mean, we talk about, yes, he was a comedian, and yes, he worked on TV, and you say, cometh the hour, cometh the man. But looking a little bit more into his family and his family's history, his dad's a mathematician, his mum was an engineer for sort of many years, his granddad fought in the Red Army against the Nazis. So there is this very serious side to him. In fact, they call him the chameleon of politics, and they said he's now taken on his khaki colours, but, you know, failing in the polls to now being, as he was before this attack by Russia, and he's now there staying with his people, saying the right words. And you will know as well as me, Kev, and you, Phil, we know comedians. They are wordsmiths. They do see things in a very different way. A lot of them are geniuses in their way. And isn't that what people need now? They need that craftsmanship, as it were, of the words, the support, and that bravery to stand there and be with them.
But talking about you, Kevin, about the no-fly zone, it goes to show how important NATO is, doesn't it, in all of this? You know, I mean, I grew up, you know, there was obviously the Cold War, but even to me, you know, NATO, it didn't really seem as if it was that important. It was something we would belong to, and everyone said it was a good thing. But Ukraine, what's happening in Ukraine, you really see, you know, the difference between those countries who are in NATO and those countries who aren't in NATO, and absolutely how vital that alliance is.
Absolutely. I wonder to what extent, perhaps, if when this was beginning, when we realised there was a problem about to really open up, whether or not at that point then a no-fly zone was established prior to Putin actually making the first move, whether that would have been sort of a preventative form for what's happening, you know.
And then maybe another issue which you raised, Kevin, there was this attack on a nuclear plant. Should nuclear fallout come from that? Should it go into a country that is in NATO? Again, could that be something that triggers Article 5 being questioned today? And I looked and I thought, who on heaven's earth would attack a nuclear plant? And I thought, what messages is he sending there? Is this posturing on the absolute extreme? This is what I can do. I will take out down the world. Is he also saying there is a vulnerability there with nuclear power because I have all the gas and the oil? And I'm wondering how many subliminal message. So absolute fear, it is a psychological war. What is he saying to the world, and what is he also reiterating about his dominance in the gas and oil
Well, it also shows he doesn't care about the Russian people, because they'd be one of the worst affected by it.
He does. You only have to look at the children, for goodness sake, that were laying flowers and protesting about, you know, they were anti-war people. Kids, they were children behind bars. They were, you know, and how crazy is that? And a complete shutdown on news now, you know, BBC and all the rest of them, you know, because there's a 15-year jail sentence if you say anything, if you mention the word war.
Yeah, it's unbelievable.
Because that would be fake news. Now, Philip, what have you?
Well, the story that caught my eye this week on a different tack, Kevin, was there's a new prison been opened in Northamptonshire, in Wellingborough. It's called HMP 5 Wells. And it's been hailed as the future of prisons.
Right.
Now, people might think it's a bit soft, so they call people there residents, not inmates.
Oh, right.
The cells are called rooms, they're all en suite.
No cells, are you? Oh, really?
They're all en suite. Okay. They've got snooker tables, table tennis tables, sports pitches. I mean, the full works. Now, it actually reminded me, somebody was saying, yeah, this is how ridiculous this is, this newfangled thing of calling cells rooms. I can tell you this isn't new, because 15 years ago, I put in a parliamentary question to ask how many prisoners had keys to their own cells. The thing you've got to remember about all this, Kevin, is that I always say to people, whatever you think can't possibly happen is almost certainly happening, okay? And so I put in a question thinking, what's something in the justice system that couldn't possibly happen? Prisoners having keys to their own cells. So I put in a question, how many prisoners have got keys to their own cells? And the government came back and said they didn't know. So I did an FOI request to every prison in Yorkshire, right? And asked them. Now, as it happens, believe it or not, 2/3 of prisoners have got keys to their own cells, right? This is 15 years ago. 2/3 of prisoners have got keys to their own. You couldn't make this stuff up. But actually, during the course of this, the governor of the Young Offenders Institute at Wetherby left a message on my phone to say, I've just received your freedom of information request about how many prisoners have got keys to their own cells. He said, I just want to let you know that in our establishment, none of our prisoners, although we prefer to call them trainees, have got any keys to their cells, although we prefer to call them rooms, which I thought was rather gratuitous that we had to have this sort of lecture about. So, you know, here we go, 5 Wells prison in Wellingborough, where prisoners are called residents, and they have rooms. But I can tell everybody this is nothing new. This has been going on for donkey's years.
And what I can also tell you, Kevin, is Philip is forensic in his research into things, and when he doesn't get an answer, trust me, he is a demon in freedom of information there. And like he says, he likes to know what you wouldn't think was possibly happening is. So we will call that, I think we're going to have to do a new section just for you, believe it or not. And another thing, believe it or not, which came out is who was helping build this prison, Philip?
Yes,
so
the great bit is that the prison was partly designed by prisoners. And actually, the cells and everything apparently the design was done by convicted burglars.
Oh, that's
I feel
give them the key.
They've got the key. They've got burglars designing it. You know, prisoners designing it. So, like I said, believe it or not. But just one quick story I'd like to touch upon because it didn't really get much news coverage, though it was in some reports and it was in the BMA, and that was about mandatory vaccinations of NHS staff and care workers. And the government has now reversed that policy. Many of us were saying, I particularly was arguing it needed to be reversed. We were going to lose up to 100,000 NHS staff. We lost tens of thousands of care workers back in November. They did a consultation of 90,000 people, and that was health and social care professionals and the public. 96% of the public said it needed to be dropped, and overall 90% of everybody said it needed to be dropped. So what I say now is we need compensation for those care workers who lost their jobs. They were sacked back in November, and help getting back into work. This no jab, no job policy was a disgrace. The public thought it, but thank goodness the government has now turned on that.
Brilliant. Well done leading the campaign on that too.
Thank you, Kevin.
My pleasure.
Kevin Woodford.
Now, there are now well over 1 million refugees who've been forced to leave Ukraine, the vast majority heading to Poland and other countries in Eastern Europe.
But what obligations do Western nations like the UK have to take in their share of refugees? As the government constantly updates its policy towards people coming from Ukraine, there was one voice calling for caution. Let's hear what Sir Edward Lee, MP, had to say during a debate in the Commons earlier this week.
Sir Edward Lee. Everybody wants to be humanitarian, and we're under pressure, or she's under pressure, to have a visa-free scheme like the rest of Europe. But may I actually congratulate her on her proportionate response? I think we have to remember that unlike the rest of Europe, we have uniquely liberal labour laws and we speak English. So we are the country of choice for mass immigration. And therefore, I do urge her to, as well as listen to all these humanitarian voices, to listen to the voices of people, for instance, in Lincolnshire, where we feel we've done really our bit in terms of migration from Eastern Europe, where we're under extreme pressure in terms of housing and jobs. I know this is difficult to say, but we have to be honest about this. And may I therefore be a correcting voice in this and congratulate her on her humanitarian but proportionate response and not throwing away the immigration rulebook.
So does Edward Lee have a point? Let's ask the man himself. Edward, thanks for joining us on GB News. As this situation develops, has your position on this shifted at all?
No, I mean, I've been getting a lot of hate emails, as you might imagine, Philip, since then. Dozens and dozens of people who say that they have a very caring attitude, but don't hesitate to misrepresent MPs when they make a reasonable and moderate point. I said that we've got to be humanitarian, but I made the point that we are the country of choice for mass migration because we have very liberal labour laws and we speak English. So I haven't changed my opinion at all. But I have stressed, of course, that I support the efforts of the government to have a sponsorship scheme and to allow relatives of those already here to come here. I think that's a very moderate position.
And Sir Edward, you know, what people need to appreciate and what you did there and what the Houses of Parliament's about and that debating chamber is to hear everybody's point of view, to hear what you've got to say, what your constituents have got to say. And sometimes people might not like it, but I always think you sharpen up your response, you sharpen up what you do, and you do much better policy if you listen to everybody. So even if you don't like what somebody said, you bringing those matters forward is important for our democracy.
Well, I think my job is to speak up for the silent majority. There are many people with small c conservative views who feel they're not represented in Parliament. It would have been very easy for me to join everybody else in that question time to Priti Patel, to criticise her, to say that we must open our doors, we must have a visa-free policy like the rest of Europe. But that is not practical politics. And all over the country, in my county, in your counties, our service is under extreme pressure. And therefore, we have to have, yes, a humanitarian approach, but a proportionate response. And that's why I think Priti Patel is an excellent Home Secretary. I think she understands this. She's not going to just open our doors to mass migration. That wouldn't help anyway. So I think that we're taking the right course. But you're right, Esther. If you actually try and go against the sort of liberal trend in Parliament, you do just receive a mass of hate mails. But that's not going to stop us from speaking out, because that's our job.
So, Edward, some people will say, well, look, you know, there's 1 million have gone over the border into Poland. We've seen Germans waiting at the railway station to take in people from Ukraine who have gone over the border there. That, you know, these people they're fleeing a brutal war. They're not people, you know, coming over in dinghies, scamming the system or anything like that. These are genuine refugees. And so, you know, shouldn't we really be giving some homes and refuge to people who are fleeing this brutal war?
Well, we are, Philip. We're going to probably allow in 200,000. I doubt it'll be 200,000. I think it might be more like 500,000. But put yourself in the position of somebody who is fleeing war from Ukraine, from Syria, from Iraq, from all over the world. You arrive in a safe country like Poland, you travel to France. You don't actually want to stay in France or Italy. In Italy, most firms are family run. Obviously, you don't speak Italian, you speak English, you can't get a job. Your country of choice is to come here. And therefore, if we listen to the voices of the Labour Party and had a visa-free scheme and said that everybody who arrives in Europe can come here, we would be simply overwhelmed. And therefore, I know this is difficult to say. I know it sounds, some people would say it's hard-hearted. It's not hard-hearted, actually. The sensible and right thing to do is to say that if you are a relative of somebody already here, if you're Ukrainian and you're a relative of somebody here, we will fast-track you and we will let you into our country. But I'm afraid at the moment we can't do more. It's a difficult thing to say, but that is the practicalities of it.
Sir Edward Lee, thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning. And I'd be interested to know what our viewers think, whether they agree with Edward's point. We'd love to hear from you at gbviews at gbnews.uk. I personally think he's got a fair point in that, you know, we don't have enough houses for people who are already here in the country. And when you make an offer, you've got to be able to deliver on it. You can't just sort of have everybody coming in and you've got nowhere to go. So I think Edward's got a fair point.
A couple of things here, isn't it? Last night we've increased the scheme. It's not a year visa people will get now. If you've got families here, we've now increased that. It's going to be a 3-year visa, and it looks like we'll be processing applications, 6,000 applications a week. And I think also we need to take on board, we are supporting people coming from Afghanistan at the moment. We are still supporting people from Syria. We're supporting people coming over from Hong Kong. So I think Edward Lee was talking about that as well. We are helping people. But I think that connection with the family here, we do have to support people fleeing, bombs and destruction and war. So we want to hear from you. But coming up, we'll be live in Ukraine with the very latest. Stay with us.
Good morning. I'm Alex Deakin with your latest weather update from the Met Office. The weekend promises quite a bit of sunshine for many of us, but a fairly dull and damp, dismal day across eastern England today. Mostly thanks to this rather stubborn weather front that's been with us for a number of days. But high pressure is building in elsewhere. It's led to a pretty cold start with a frost for Scotland, Northern Ireland. But equally, plenty of sunshine to come here through the day. Just 1 or 2 scattered showers across the far north. That weather front, though, making for a dull, dismal, damp day from parts of Yorkshire down to East Anglia and the southeast, maybe at times also affecting the East Midlands. The West Midlands westwards, however, mostly dry and bright. Sunny skies for Wales, southwest England, northwest England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, with temperatures maybe getting up to double figures. Feeling cold, though, further east with the clouds sticking here. Temperatures only 6 degrees, say, in Hull, maybe squeaking up to 7 in Norwich. The patchy rain will continue here through this evening, but gradually start to drift a little further west, so we'll see maybe a bit of rain trickling towards Birmingham, maybe even Cardiff by morning time. For Scotland, Northern Ireland, again clear and again cold, -5, maybe as low as -6 in rural spots to start Sunday. The area of high pressure is well in control by Sunday. It's squeezed away that weather front finally, but it is allowing an easterly breeze to pick up across the south. So although it won't be as damp across East Anglia and the southeast on Sunday, still going to feel pretty chilly with that breeze. Maybe a few showers for Lincolnshire, the Midlands, South Wales, southwest England on Sunday, but they should be fizzling out. Again, plenty of sunshine for Scotland, Northern Ireland and much of Northern England. Again, after a frosty start, temperatures ticking up by the afternoon into the high single figures, 7, 8, 9 Celsius. But don't forget, across the south, although a little drier in the southeast, that wind will make it feel really quite cold tomorrow.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back. We've got some of your views, Phil.
Paul says prison should be a deterrent, not a hotel. When we treat prisoners better than the law-abiding populace, there is a problem.
And Gary says, I would like to see international arrest warrants issued for Puto and his billionaire friends around him until those decent world leaders stop sitting around tables with those potential despots. Then nothing will change. So keep your views coming in.
With so many major cities in Ukraine currently under siege from Russian forces, it's hard to conceive what life is like for the civilians who haven't been able to escape.
Let's speak to Yulia Osmolovska, a former Ukrainian diplomat and executive director of the Eastern European Security Institute, who is currently in Kiev. Yulia, firstly, can I check that you are well and safe? And can you give us an update of what's been happening where you are?
Well, I'm relatively well and safe compared to those my colleagues who are right now stuck in the eastern cities of Ukraine. In Kiev, it's relatively. However, we do expect some new attacks and rocket attacks on the city, and some parts of Kiev and mostly suburbs in north and east and west had been destroyed completely by Russian forces, by missiles and rockets. So, for God's sake, I'm always fine so far. Thank you.
Yulia, we obviously wish you all the very best. We just wondered what morale is like amongst Ukrainians at the moment. There was a poll that came out yesterday from Lord Ashcroft here, who'd done some polling of Ukrainians, which showed that 85% of men and 63% of women said they were willing to take up arms and fight. And is that the kind of is that what you would recognise? Would you recognise those figures from what you've been from speaking to people in Ukraine?
Yeah, sure. This is something that we call Putin paradox. It means that he has something like to put control on Ukraine, to get Ukraine split it into two parts, and with the means that he using to achieve these goals, he received completely opposite results, because the level of resistance here is extremely high, and those people, those Ukrainians speaking Russian or Ukrainian, it doesn't matter, because they help each other and they are very decisive in their resistance towards the Russian invaders. So I think that we have to thank Putin for making this more stronger unity among Ukrainians, and it is definitely no longer the case of talking about two parts of Ukraine splitting apart.
There was another poll result here, and it said 56% of Ukrainian people thought the conflict would be over at the end of March, and only 9% thought that it would last longer than 6 months. What do you think to that?
Well, it's difficult to assess, especially from my point of being an expert and trying to analyze all the possible scenarios and development. From one hand, definitely there are hopes that Russians are just getting weaker in their campaign, because they just calculated that it would last from 1 to 3 days to conquer Kiev, and they haven't achieved that. So, and they've got all their logistics and supply chains to their troops broken so far, so they can't support them. For instance, we have some Russian troops standing not far from Kiev and 25 kilometers distance, and they are not approaching Kiev just because they don't have sufficient support for that so far. So there are some predictions, and I do rely here on the assessment of Christa Grozdy from Bellingcat, who said that till Sunday Russians' ability to attack will be drawn up. But also we do understand that listening to Russian claims, because they haven't still withdrawn the initial ultimatum, like Ukraine should get rid of its NATO and EU aspirations, we have to recognize Crimea as a Russian territory, and we have to recognize so-called independent republics in the east. So they're still trying to put this case forward in negotiations. That means they don't feel themselves being on a weak position. Therefore, there are assessments that conflict might last longer than just 3 days or 2 weeks.
What would you like to see the international community doing? Is there more that you think they should be doing to assist Ukraine?
Yes, they've done definitely much more than we had expected at the beginning, and especially before the invasion, because I think that eventually the Western partners had realized the real threat coming from Russia, and they understood that if they don't support Ukraine right now, so next in line would be some countries of Eastern Europe, like Poland and Baltics, because Putin also claimed that there are some disputable territorial issues with Poland and with Baltics. So it's definitely next logical step to expect from Russia. But on the other hand, the key issue right now, which we are asking for, it's a no-fly zone over Ukraine, because Russians being failed in their blitzkrieg campaign, they started just to do extermination war and the war to extinction. So they try just to shell the cities of Ukraine up to the very ruins for all the civilians not to survive in it. So it means that we definitely need the NATO partners to stay strong on this no-fly zone. And we know that today or tomorrow they will be voting in Congress on the same issue. And we also know that the general public worldwide supports no-fly zone over Ukraine. And listening to what you've been discussing a bit earlier than I appeared on your TV. I know that one of the psychological fears is that this would mean direct interaction of NATO and Russia. But it has already happened in Ukrainian soil, because what Russians say, they say that it means that Russia in direct war with NATO countries, but they're fighting on Ukrainian soil.
Yulia Osmolovska, thank you so much for joining us. We wish you all the best. Stay safe, and we wish you and your fellow Ukrainians all the very best.
The NATO nations have rallied in response to the Ukrainian crisis, but has it gone far enough? And what about the role of the biggest member of NATO, the United States?
We're fortunate enough to be joined in the studio by Sir Christopher Mayer, former British ambassador to Washington, who also served as a diplomat in Moscow. Sir Christopher, what have you made of President Biden's response to the situation in Ukraine so far?
Well, rhetorically, he's been extremely firm about all this. The Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, has been equally firm. They've said all the right things. They have come back actually into a kind of leadership role now in NATO as the most powerful military and political nation in the organization. And I don't think we in Europe or in the United Kingdom can complain about the role the Americans have played. Now, if we go straight into, if you'll forgive me, into this question of a no-fly zone, a no-fly zone, even if we were to decide that this was the right thing to do politically and militarily, we couldn't do, because we don't have the resources and we don't have the aircraft to do it without the direct participation of the United States of America, because only they have the aerial resources to match those of Russia. So the next thing that we'll be looking at in Washington, we, the rest of the alliance, we here in London, is whether Biden and the White House will feel themselves so pushed by public pressure. And I'm not sure there's all that much indignation at the moment in the US compared with Europe about the way, appalling way that the Russians are behaving, to actually push Congress to vote a resolution in favor of a no-fly zone. If that were to happen, I think it would result in a very, very serious debate inside NATO about whether we wish to cross this red line.
I mean, the thing that makes everybody nervous in NATO countries is, can we be sure that Joe Biden and the US would actually take action if Putin sort of went into a NATO country? Can they be relied upon to honour those treaty obligations? And what would it take? Would it be a stray missile be enough to get Biden to do that and the US to do that? Would it need to be more of an incursion? Or how robust are America and Biden and the US public, I guess, in honouring its NATO commitments?
I think that you can rely on President Biden and his staff, his Secretary of State and his Defense Secretary, to agree and to act on Article 5 of the NATO treaty, which, as you know, means that if one member of the alliance is attacked, then all the others come to their assistance. And the only time in the history of NATO that this has been invoked was indeed at the time of 9/11, when the alliance said, we stand foursquare behind the United States and will act with the US against the terrorists, Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and all that. So I don't have any doubts about the American commitment. If a NATO ally, a member of NATO, benefits from Article 5, which of course Ukraine doesn't, because it's not a member of NATO, I have no doubt at all that, say, if one of the Baltic states were attacked by Russia, that the full force of NATO would not retaliate.
Following on from Philip's point there, do you think Biden has maybe been emboldened following the sort of chaotic departure from Afghanistan?
Putin emboldened?
No, I'm not. I'm talking about Biden being emboldened because he had such a chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan. So rather than what you might have perceived a weak Biden, because of that, he's now going to be emboldened to do something if he needs to. And did you take comfort from his State of the Union speech?
Well, the State of the Union speech was, I think, a very, very eloquent speech. It was mainly about domestic policy and about 10 minutes on foreign policy and what he had to say about Ukraine and freedom versus tyranny and all that stuff. all that rhetoric was perfectly acceptable, perfectly normal, and actually quite well delivered, given that he has problems now with
Except he did make a major faux pas, didn't he?
Yeah, he said Iran he said Iranian instead of Ukraine.
Well, that's a pretty major faux pas,
It's a huge faux pas, but you know, it's such a huge faux pas that you can kind of excuse it. If it had been something smaller, you might have thought, "Ooh, there's a Freudian slip there," but there was no Freudian slip. He just read his what's the thing called?
Autocue.
Thank you. You use them all the time,
yes.
Or don't you? Maybe you don't. I don't know.
No, we do a combination. Yes, we do. I'm not denying that.
So I forgive him that. What was the question? I can't remember.
It was: is he now, because of that chaotic departure from Afghanistan, is he emboldened now to do something if need be?
Well, if you look at the withdrawal from Afghanistan, what you have to agree is that the policy decision to leave Afghanistan was the right thing to do. But the way in which it was executed, which involved us as well and other NATO allies, was a total shambles. I would argue that precisely because that was such a mess, the United States is quite determined now that come another big strategic decision, it'll get the detail right. But I think if you're Putin, and thank the Lord I'm not Putin, and you're sitting in your Kremlin bunker somewhere, and you're only talking to people if there's a 15-foot table between you and them, whether it's President Macron or your own staff, you do become a bit detached from reality. And I think the Russians, and Putin in particular, have completely misread or drawn exactly the wrong conclusion from the shambles of leaving Afghanistan. And the Russians should know, because they left Afghanistan in slightly better order, but they were defeated in the end by the Afghans. As were we in 3 wars, one in the 20th century, 2 in the 19th. Russians got beaten up. NATO then got beaten up, led by the Americans. We got nowhere at all in 20 years. And I believe, if I've got this right, Alexander the Great, whichever century that might have been, BC, got as far as Afghanistan and decided this is not for me and left. Although I think the town of Kandahar is named after Alexander.
I just wanted quickly just to ask if you could, what do you expect Putin to do? Do you expect him to stop at Ukraine, or do you think he'll want to try and recreate another mini Soviet Union with the countries that aren't in NATO? Well, just quickly, what would you?
Very good question. It depends what the outcome is in Ukraine. If it turns out horribly for the Russians, and it's kind of moving in that way, and they have to occupy with an army Ukraine and keep it pacified, they will not want to go off anywhere else. If it had been easier, then I think they would have started to look into, not at the Baltic states, because that's NATO, I think they would have started to interfere in the Western Balkans, in Serbia, Bosnia, around there, which is one of their traditional spheres of influence.
So Christopher Mayer, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Coming up, we'll be speaking to John Glenn, the Economic Secretary to the Treasurer, on the latest sanctions against Russia.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back. So far, it seems Western sanctions have had little effect on persuading Russia to pause, let alone end its bloody campaign in Ukraine. So what impact are these sanctions having? And has the UK government gone far enough?
We can speak now to City Minister and Economic Secretary to the Treasury, John Glenn. John, thanks for joining us this morning. On sanctions, what has the government done so far, and what further plans do you have to increase sanctions on Russia and the supporters of the Putin regime?
Well, we moved pretty early and quickly with allies in the US and the EU to deal with some of the banks, to get alignment and exclusion from the SWIFT system. We've worked on stopping the Russian central bank use its foreign currency reserves to prop up the economy. And we saw an immediate impact in terms of about a third of the value of the ruble taken off almost overnight. Obviously, the Russian stock exchange hasn't been able to function. We've seen the London Stock Exchange delist about 30 companies. But we do recognise that there's more to be done. So next Monday in the House of Commons, we will be bringing forward the economic crime bill. And there are a number of measures in that which will make it easier to move more quickly. We'll streamline the legislation so that we can actually take that list of prescribed entities and individuals and move forward to actually delivering the sanctions. In normal times, that legal framework has lots of safeguards, but for the almost unique circumstances we face with what Putin is doing in the Ukraine, it's right that we bring forward that legislation so we can actually get to those individuals and get to that sanctioning moment without the same longer process that we have at the moment.
Many of my constituents have been in touch with me to say that they very much welcome what the government's been doing. We've just heard from a Ukraine diplomat saying that she thought that the international community had done more than they'd originally expected. But some of my constituents say that it seems that other countries in the EU seem to have gone faster at sanctioning particular Russian oligarchs and things like that. Is that true? Could we have gone faster to sanction particular individuals who are supporting the Putin regime?
Well, I think we've worked together with allies in many areas. It's important you do work together, otherwise you leave gaps where that money can go. I certainly recognise that this bill will be very welcome on Monday to move things forward, make it easier for the Foreign Office lawyers to do their work. But I don't accept that somehow we're significantly behind. We played a significant role in bringing the EU and the US together on SWIFT, for example, on the banking elements. But this legislation is urgent. We want to get it through on Monday. I hope we can get a cross-party agreement, and we will then be able to move forward more swiftly on that, on the specifics of individuals. But it is about, as I say, streamlining that legal process to make it a bit easier to move forward.
Set out how the damage that's happened to the Russian economy, the collapse in the currency and the rest of it. Many of our viewers might be interested to know what you assess the impact might be of these sanctions on our economy. What pain might we suffer from these sanctions?
Well, we look very carefully at that, and obviously there are implications to the wider energy market, which we're not directly dependent in the same way that some of our friends in Europe are. And obviously you'll have seen the impact on the prices, the future prices of some commodities like wheat. We recognise that there will be issues as we move forward. I mean, that's why on the cost of living crisis, you'll obviously know that the Chancellor brought forward last month a number of interventions to assist more generally. But obviously these things will develop over time, and partly it's difficult to be certain because we don't know, how long this invasion will last and how it will play out. But we're aware across the different departments of government, different commodities and different supplies that may be disrupted, and we look very carefully at that in every case and find alternatives where we can.
John Glenn, thank you very much for joining us this morning, because I know you've been working flat out, and to get emergency legislation through on Monday, I know what that takes as well, because we know how long legislation usually comes through. So thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning.
Thank you both. Thanks very much. See you on Monday.
Ahead of International Women's Day next week, we wanted to speak to a truly inspirational woman, someone who has helped transform both business and show business in this country.
I'm Debbie Moore, founder and owner of one of the biggest and best-known dance centres in the world, Pineapple Dance Studios here in the heart of Covent Garden. I opened the business in 1979 when disco fever was at its height. I left grammar school in Manchester at the age of 15 with no qualifications and planned on being a typist. But winning a modelling competition thankfully changed all that. I moved to London, I modelled during the day, and I danced in a Covent Garden dance centre at night. And then one day in 1978, I noticed they were closing. It was terrible, but suddenly I thought, here's an opportunity. And so I found an old pineapple warehouse, and that's why it's called Pineapple. And I just say, thank God it wasn't a banana warehouse.
Debbie Moore, OBE, the founder of Pineapple Dance Studios, not Banana Dance Studios, but Pineapple Dance Studios and clothing range. The first woman to launch a PLC on the London Stock Exchange is here with us in the studio now. So, Debbie, I'm so glad that we had this opportunity to look at your incredible career. And did you always want to go into business? Was that what you always wanted to do?
No, of course not. I sometimes I think I'm a total imposter, really. Being the first woman to go public. I mean, it took a girl a model from Manchester with a dance studio. It just didn't seem right somehow, but it happened. And the main reason that I did that was because I was getting lots of dancers from America, from New York City Ballet. All wanted a pineapple in New York. And I said, surely you've got one bigger and better. But they hadn't. They really hadn't got an open dance centre. So that was the reason. I'd borrowed enough by this time from the bank. And so that's the reason I went public, was to open in New York and to expand the clothing side.
And then you sort of opened back up this dance studio that other people didn't think would work. So what was it about you that was determined to make Pineapple work, a dance studio work in London?
I think that, if we just go back a little bit, when I was modelling and I married a photographer, the cliche. We were the, Shrimpton and Bailey of the North. And we even did a programme called Model Couple. And anyway, one day, when I got married at 19, and when I was 21, he ran off with a 17-year-old. And it broke my heart, totally. And I piled on weight. This sort of shock, heartbreak, made me have an underactive thyroid. I put all this weight on. And was going to be on drugs for the rest of, thyroxine and side effects and everything. So then I found a doctor, a homeopathic doctor, who said that he'd cure me. And so then he said, and weaned me off the drugs and said, the best way to lose weight is dancing. It's the finest form of exercise. every muscle in your body, it's uplifting. And so he said, find a dance class. It wasn't easy, but there was a broken down dance studio. And this is in the 70s. And I used to go and do Arlene Phillips' class with my mate, Lorraine Chase. And off we went. And suddenly it closed down. One Monday there was a notice said closing Friday. So this was my light bulb moment. So I rushed and got all the teachers' phone numbers, and we got a petition going to try and keep it open. And then just across the road, and by this time Covent Garden was derelict because the whole fruit and market and the fruit and flower and veg had moved out. So there were all these empty warehouses, and that's, as I say, it was an old derelict pineapple warehouse, so we started. And I wanted to not have a small broken, I wanted a big place so that everyone could come to totally break down those elitist barriers that were around dance and make it accessible to everyone, which is what it is, from 3 to 103 and all.
So what I want to get right is this. So this brute who ran away with a 17-year-old, you were 21, he ran away, you then put weight on, and out of that awful occurrence, you then set up this business, become a multi-millionairess. Have you ever gone back to this chap and said, thank you for running off with a younger woman, you've made me a millionaire, you've made me a top businesswoman?
I actually say thank you, Rosemary.
Oh, is that the lady's name?
And she worked in the pub in Altrincham. Just, a northern thing.
So Esther mentioned, Debbie, about the fact that, you were a female first in many respects, and certainly listing your company on the stock exchange in a man's world. I just wondered who were your role models? Who were your inspiration at the time that made you realise that I can do this?
The thing is that I was on a mission. There was such a need. There was nowhere now to do a dance class, and I realised how important dance is for your health as well as everything else. And plus, it was the beginning of MTV, of music videos. It was the beginning of shows coming on.
Can I just point out here, yes, that you on the London Stock Exchange, first woman there to float a company, and I believe in that photo next to you is Nigel Farage's father.
Dad, yes. Yeah. The first time I met Nigel, he sort of gave me a hug, and I said, oh, hi. So he said, I've grown up with you in my kitchen. I said, really? So he said, this picture was on the kitchen wall. So he's obviously, younger than me then. That's what he was saying. When he was a little boy, he used to look at
But what you did, and this is what's incredible, and this is why I want to say, what is it, the vision you have? Because yes, there was the 80s, there was dance, there was fame, there was then everybody coming into your studios, whether it was people making music videos, whether it was the West End, whether it was the ballet, everybody coming in. But then dancers were saying, oh, we don't really like our dance clothes, they're not as trendy as they should be. And you were instrumental in bringing in Lycra, changing the whole sort of dancewear and then making it dance streetwear.
Yeah, exactly. So it was nylon, and it was nylon piqué, and it was in school uniform colours, leotards in sort of brown and green and maroon. And so I thought, well, instead of this stretchy nylon, what if we get cotton with Lycra? And so I went to DuPont, and they were looking for something to do with Lycra because they'd been using it in corsetry. And so we developed cotton Lycra, and they sent me footage. And so then I made leotards and what were called footless tights, we now call them leggings. And then I thought, well, this is nice for a little skirt. And how wouldn't it be great as a dress? And so it began. We were the first people to use Lycra in outerwear, and of course it's in men's suits. Probably got a bit in yours.
No, he's got the leggings on underneath, Debbie.
Hey, well.
Underneath this desk.
Promise not to tell any. Promise not to tell
anybody. It's a pair of leggings, and he loves doing high kicks. But you, got an honorary degree for all the work you did in this field, for sort of just changing, as I said, the look of the 80s.
Well, it was so I got an honorary master's degree, and it was for really pioneering and kind of revolutionising the way women dressed, and so instead of skirts with zips and blouse, it was suddenly this new way to dress, and it was all at the same time of all this happening at the beginning of the 80s. So the timing was all in the success, really.
And you are you're a pioneer. You say that word yourself. You've won that prestigious Veuve Clicquot Award. You've got an OBE from the Queen. You do support women in business significantly. And you wrote a book, How to Support People, and then I read that it was actually redone for the Chinese community and Chinese women. So around the world you've been helping people. But can you explain what it is that you've got to be an entrepreneur?
I mean, it's a sort of overused word in many ways. I just think I was brought up in Manchester, and my dad was a plumber. My mum, worked in a mail order company. There was a great work ethic. I always had a Saturday job. I was usherette in Hale Cinema in the holidays, and I worked in the Wimpy Bar in Stretford, and so I just had a kind of work ethic in me, and then I it was quite hard work modelling. I went all over the world, and I did mail order catalogues as well as TV commercials and things. But I don't know really. I just think I was always busy, and then I saw this moment, and I had such respect for how hard dancers work.
But is it looking at the need? Is it looking at a need and then giving a response, giving an answer, and then seeing it through?
Yeah.
Have I just said it then? Is that what it is?
Well done. Yeah, you know me better than I know myself.
But it's 40 years, isn't it, this year? It's a big year for you this year.
It's 44 years since I signed the lease for Pineapple, but I went public in 1982, so that's 40 years since I did.
Well, I can say one of the most inspirational business women who has carried on being at the front of transformation and change. And I know in lockdown, you put Pineapple online, again, at the cutting edge of what was happening. And that is why she's one of the most successful business people in the country.
And that was Laura, though, I have to say.
And
Laura
that's your
worked
daughter.
very hard to do that, and she's a wheelchair user, and it's very, very difficult for her to have done anything in Pineapple, but to get all these online classes going when we were in lockdown so people could still keep dancing and all the children
and Lana also is an absolute pioneer for people with disabilities.
Yes,
has herself.
she is.
Well, Debbie, thank you so much for coming in. International Women's Day next Tuesday. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Coming up, we'll bring you all the latest on the Ukraine situation. Stay with us.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Good morning. This is the Saturday selection here on GB News with Esther McVeigh and Philip Davis. Coming up, we're discussing the payout of vaccine damages, or lack of them. We'll be examining the health of Britain's independent cinema chains after the battering the business has taken during the pandemic. And we've got all the usual Saturday sport and showbiz. But first, let's get the very latest on the situation in Ukraine and the rest of the day's news headlines.
Good morning. It's 2 minutes past 11. I'm Olivia Guthrie in the GB newsroom. Russia is reportedly not observing an agreed temporary ceasefire in 2 areas of Ukraine. Authorities in Mariupol say fighting is taking place in the Zaporizhzhia region, which is where the humanitarian corridor ends. The Ukrainian government says they plan to evacuate around 200,000 people from Mariupol and 15,000 from Volnovakha. Ukraine says Russian forces have focused attacks on the capital, Kiev, with loud explosions heard overnight. Prime Minister Boris Johnson says the Kremlin's actions are an abomination and the world is turning its back on Moscow.
Global corporations are severing ties with Russia. Participation in sporting events is being cancelled. And nation after nation is taking a stand. The vice is tightening its grip, and it will continue to tighten.
The Ministry of Defence says the rate of Russian air and artillery strikes in Ukraine has slowed in the last 24 hours. An intelligence briefing from the MOD reports Ukraine continues to hold on to the cities Kharkiv, Cherniv and Mariupol. There's also been street fighting in Sumy, and authorities say it's highly likely all 4 cities are surrounded by Russian forces. Aid agencies are warning of a humanitarian disaster as food, water and medical supplies run short. Former NATO planner Philip Ingram told GB News Ukraine should brace itself for more Russian aggression.
The Ukrainians, a much smaller, weaker force on paper, but with a real resolve that shows the human element of it, are holding back the Russians. In military terms, they fixed them. The Russians haven't got the ability to maneuver, and they've stopped them achieving their objectives. The trouble is, historically, when the Russians don't get their objectives, they then start to go really nasty, and we're in for the long game.
Meanwhile, the Ukrainian president has accused NATO of weakness after it refused to implement a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Volodymyr Zelensky says people will die because of the West's inaction. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken says the suffering is likely to get worse before it gets better.
The only way to actually implement something like a no-fly zone is to send NATO planes into Ukrainian airspace and to shoot down Russian planes, and that could lead to a full-fledged war. In Europe, President Biden has been clear that we are not going to get into a war with Russia.
Well, President Zelensky also posted a new message online this morning denying reports he's left Ukraine.
Good evening. Every day there are rumours that I've run away from Ukraine, from Kiev or from the office. As you can see, I am here. I'm in my place and my team is also here. Nobody ran anywhere. We are working. We love jogging, but now is not a time for exercise. So we are working. Glory to Ukraine.
Meanwhile, Russia has blocked access to Facebook for its citizens. The state regulator says the social media platform has been taken down for its discrimination against Russian media. Facebook Vice President of Global Affairs, Sir Nick Clegg, says Russians have been silenced from speaking out. Formula One team has sacked its Russian driver following the country's invasion of Ukraine. Nikita Mazepin's contract has been terminated by the American-owned team Haas. It says he will not race in Formula One this season. The team also ended its deal with its Russian sponsor Uralkali, owned by Mr. Mazepin's father. In other news, a man has appeared in court via video link on suspicion of stabbing his divorced parents to death. 40-year-old William Warrington is charged with the murder of 67-year-old Clive and 73-year-old Valerie. On Wednesday, Mr. Warrington was found dead in Cheltenham, and later that day, Mrs. Warrington's body was discovered in a village 15 miles away. Tributes are pouring in for the cricket star Shane Warne, who has died at the age of 52. The Australian leg spinner reportedly suffered a heart attack in Thailand. And Britain has won its first medal in the Winter Paralympics in Beijing. Skier Millie Knight and guide Brett Wild have won bronze in the women's visually impaired downhill. This is GB News. We'll bring you more news as it happens. Now let's return to Saturday Selection.
Thanks for joining us. This is the Saturday Selection here on GB News. I'm Esther McVeigh.
And I'm Philip Davis. Coming up, we'll be asking why the government is taking so long to compensate families affected by complications caused by the COVID vaccine.
But first, celebrity chef and TV presenter and award-winning TV presenter Kevin Woodford is with us. So tell us, what have you seen in today's papers?
I love this. Right, now, I'm a great believer in rewarding people that have achieved great things. And perhaps one of the greatest things that you could be awarded is a knighthood, right? A knighthood. Because what a knighthood will do, the minute you make a reservation in a restaurant and it's Sir Kevin or Sir Philip or Lady...
I'm going to ask you, have you ever pretended?
Never. Name what? Come on. Never. You know me better than that. But you're going to get a good table. If you're going to... You're travelling with BA or whoever. There are other airlines available. You're travelling with whichever airline and you go... And it's Sir Kevin, oh, come with me, and there's a glass of champagne, right? So you deserve that because you've achieved great things. Because to get that knighthood, then... You know, the criteria should be that over a long period of time, you've really given it to the country. You've done your bit. So come on, two MPs next to me. You tell me, how does lacklustre Gavin Williamson get this? Because I wouldn't give him a Blue Peter badge, quite frankly, but he got a knighthood, right? Now, I think the problem with this, right, is this is a guy, I'm sure he's a lovely man. And I'm sure you know him, and he might be a friend, and you might have a glass of wine with him in the bar and talk about his days in Scarborough. I don't know. But this is a guy, right, who was the education secretary, and I used to be, you know, a reasonably high position in a further education college. Thank goodness he wasn't my education secretary in those days, because I think he did more damage to education in our country than any other education secretary. Got sacked, becomes defence secretary, and gets sacked. Right? And because he's got a tarantula in the corner and he knows where the bodies are hidden, he gets a knighthood. Now, the problem for me with this is it makes a mockery of the whole and the value of the whole, you know, awards system. It really does. And it gives me the rage, you know, it really does. I just think that the only benefit that we have from this, right, is that we are now referring to him as Sir Gavin Williamson and not Defence Secretary Gavin Williamson. I rest my case.
You see, I think it was one of the earlier first programmes I did, actually. There was a controversy about Tony Blair getting a knighthood, wasn't there? And I got a load of stick from people when I said that I felt that it was appropriate that he should be given a knighthood, because obviously people were unhappy with the war in Iraq and all the rest of it.
Of course.
And the point I made, and so I don't want to just get all the flack back again that I got. You know, I got plenty of it that time.
Your shoulders are big enough.
But the point I made at the time about Tony Blair, you know, you might say this doesn't apply to Gavin Williamson either, but the point I made then was that it was a recognition not of how well you thought he'd done in the job necessarily, or the mistakes in whatever. It was about the roles he'd done, the service and all the rest of it, and it was a recognition of that. So, I mean, in Gavin Williamson's case, he's served in different cabinets, he's been the Chief Whip, he's been Defence Secretary, he's been Education Secretary. Now, you might say, and other people I'm sure may well agree, that you didn't think he did a particularly good job.
Well, it wasn't just me, Philip. He was
No, I understand. But would you be swayed at all by the argument that actually, irrespective of how well you or I or anybody else might think he performed, that there should be some recognition for the positions he's held and the services he's given?
No, I wouldn't.
That's not washing with you.
I think what is happening, though, there's lots of people, I think, like you, Kevin, who've come out. I mean, there's a picture and a story in the Times today, and it says this, page 14, number 10 admits knighthood for Williamson is hard to justify. So that's a headline there, and that comes from number 10. I don't know if it's a named source or it's an unnamed source. But what it does put a spotlight on who do we want to give knighthoods to or not. What is the justification of it? How do we explain it? If it can't be explained, why are you doing it? And it does seem this has caused a lot of debate in the public, and what you're doing it for, and what does it represent, and why do we keep giving them out to people? So,
is there a
that
criteria
debate is
laid
going
down?
on.
Is there actually a criteria laid down for that?
Well, it's a mystery, isn't it?
It is a mystery, because I couldn't find one. I searched and searched and searched for this. I can't find any specific criterion for awarding a knighthood at all.
Except for the Tony Blair one, a previous Prime Minister, there's certain ones that are given.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
Now, just on that note, because there were two stories that caught my eye on page 6 of the Daily Mail today, but the first one was, hallelujah, sage doommongers are stood down at last. And, of course, Chris Whitty got a knighthood after the COVID things, and I think Jonathan Van Tam, I think, got a knighthood as well, and Patrick Vallance already had a knighthood, and people might have a debate about how well they performed their task in there. And anyway, they're being stood down, which is great news, as far as I'm concerned. It was just interesting that Professor Carl Hennigan, who's Director of Evidence-Based Medicine at Oxford University, said SAGE must now face significant scrutiny over its pandemic response. The lack of advisors with healthcare experience and the over-reliance on modelling worst-case scenarios cause serious collateral damage due to lockdowns and restrictions. And I just wondered, was that another example of the government rewarding failure with a knighthood for Chris Whitty, or are you more sympathetic?
I'm far more sympathetic to Van Tam and Chris Whitty, to be quite honest with you. I think that was probably one of the most challenging roles anybody could ever have. We had this huge pandemic going on, all brand new to these guys. We've never had to deal with this at this level before, not in our lifetime. And I just think, no matter what they did, there would be criticism for whichever way they handled it, to be quite frank.
Where I'd come in here, I always say, don't be too quick to give a knighthood, because what might seem wonderful today, as we now look at the harm that lockdowns have caused, you might change your mind there. We've seen that before. Somebody you thought was a fantastic business person, they get a knighthood. A couple of years later, as we look at maybe their pension fund and various other things that happen to them, we then say we need to strip them of the knighthood. So the only thing I would say is knighthood needs to be given at the end of a career, when you can fully assess over a long period of time whether what they did in the full context actually did do good for them, the country and everybody else.
Esther, it does come back to the whole concept, doesn't it? That, here we have one of the greatest honours that our country can give anybody. And, and we're struggling to find a serious criterion laid down to actually say that, yes, this is justifiable.
I should just say, because I did say there were two stories on page 6, and I know everyone will be thinking, what was the other story? So I'm just going to mention it was Royal Mail hikes its stamps up to 95p, up 10 pence, which is pretty, is part of the cost of living crisis. But the thing that galls me about this is that loads of my constituents had problem getting their post delivered for weeks and weeks and weeks. They went weeks without anything being delivered at all. And what's their reward? Another 10 pence on stamps. So.
Well, I just wanted to end on a sort of a happy, smiley note, and this is slugs and snails are getting an image overhaul. Gardeners complaining that they munch through all your flowers. They've been described as a pest, but no longer. They're now going to be healthy for the ecosystem. And after slugs and snails, I think the next one, not going to be called a pest and going to get a bit of PR on it, is the wasp. I just thought I'd let you know that. So bugs, slugs, wasps are getting a PR makeover. Kevin Woodford, amazing having you with us again, and I hope to see you back here soon.
Absolutely.
Now, whilst the various various COVID vaccines have proved to be both effective and safe, as with any vaccine, there will always be a tiny number of people who suffer side effects and an even smaller number who sadly die.
As of this week, there were 920 claims from families whose loved ones have suffered severe illness or even death because of the vaccine. But to date, not a single application for financial support has been approved.
We're joined in the studio by Dr. Claire Craig, a diagnostic pathologist who is co-chair of Heart. But first, let's speak to Sir Christopher Chope, MP. Chris, you brought up this issue in Parliament this week. I just wondered what made you speak out about it?
Because I brought forward a private member's bill to reform the 1979 Vaccine Damage Act and bring it up to speed in the context of COVID-19 vaccinations. And since then, I did a short debate in September. Since then, I've become the focus of a sort of a national interest on this. And I received thousands of emails from across the country from people who have themselves suffered or their loved ones have suffered very serious consequences from these vaccines. And they're saying, oh, when are we going to get compensation under the scheme? And the answer is, listening to the minister in response to my debate, sometime never.
Well, you made the point that nobody's been paid out even where the coroner ruled that the vaccine was the cause of death. And in the government's response to your debate, they seem to say that this was decided by the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Authority. So who should people be holding responsibility for this? The government or the MHPRA?
They should be holding the government responsible, and particularly the minister. And one good thing that came out of the debate was her willingness to meet me and answer all the questions which I put during that debate, to which she didn't provide answers. But she did concede that they were important questions. But the government can't hide behind the MHRA. This is a scheme which is designed to ensure that the people who do the right thing get the vaccines in the public interest, that if it goes wrong for them, then the public will see them right. And that was a whole process which we thought was going to apply, but it hasn't done yet. And it's now more than a year since some people suffered these dire consequences.
And I know one of the other points that you've made is that the cap on payouts is £120,000, and that's been the same since 2007, I think. And yes, hasn't been increases. And I fully appreciate that some of the terrible things that have happened to people, £120,000 won't go particularly far in helping them with their costs. What would you like to see the cap increase to?
Well, a minimum would be an inflation increase. And I asked the minister specifically whether she'd increase it now to 177,000, which would be exactly the same as it was in 2007, but in a modern day money. And she wouldn't even concede that point. So why are we effectively increasing everything else by the rate of inflation, but not increasing these compensation payments? It doesn't add up.
Christopher, I want to ask you, because I know you've got a forensic mind. You said there was a list of questions there that you haven't had the answers for yet. Can I ask you to tell us what some of those questions are that you want to get the answers to?
Well, one of them is why, if we have people who've there's evidence that the consequences they suffered were likely to have been caused by the vaccine, why are we not conceding liability in those cases and paying them out? Why are we not notifying people who sent in their yellow cards of the result of the analysis of those yellow cards? And why are we not advising them of the availability of the compensation scheme to which we've been referring? And there are lots of other questions I was asking. Why is the whole thing taking so long to deliver? Or why is it so burdensome for the applicants? And I think the answer to many of these questions is that actually the government has been in denial that there has been any harm caused by these vaccines, because the government was engaged in a propaganda war to try and persuade people that these vaccines were absolutely safe. And much of the minister's response to my debate on Wednesday was reiterating the platitude that these vaccines are safe. But since then, people have been writing to me and saying, why doesn't the government start conceding the fact that for a lot of people, these vaccines have been a disaster and have wrecked their lives forever?
So Christopher Chope, MP for Christchurch, thank you so much for joining us. Dr. Claire Craig, I just wonder, what do you make of what Christopher Chope had to say?
Well, I'm very grateful that he's making the case and standing up for people who are not really being represented. And I think you find it quite hard sometimes to get people on their side. And the reality is that that this is a challenging thing to investigate, to see whether or not a vaccine has caused a problem. And there are sort of two types of injury, really. There's the injuries where there's something that's very, very rare in the background population and very, very characteristic. And so when it does occur, you can be pretty convinced it was the vaccine that caused it. But then you can also get injuries where actually it caused something, like hypothetically, let's say a vaccine caused a heart attack. Well, there's an awful lot of heart attacks, and we're not going to compensate everybody that's had a heart attack because that would be a misuse of public funds. So there's a balance to be struck, but we're striking it the wrong way at the moment because we've got people who do have these very characteristic cases of damage where really there's already enough evidence in the public domain that the vaccines are causing these problems. And so then you have to ask a question, what's the morally right thing to do? And it kind of comes down to the probabilities. So there was a big study in America by Hansen et al., 10 million people they followed up to look at who had had Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is a problem where the immune system attacks the nervous system. And they found that the rate in the first 3 weeks after AstraZeneca was 20 per million. So it's not massive, it's a small number, 20 per million. And that would work out at 500 extra cases in the UK after the vaccine rollout campaign. So for these, what it also would mean is that if you've had that problem in that 3 week period, the chances are 95% it was the vaccine that caused it and 5% that it wasn't. And the government seemed to be taking the approach that unless you can prove you're in the 95%, you're not going to get compensated. Whereas clearly, morally, the right thing to do is to compensate everybody, including the 5% that were coincidental.
Why do you think there's been a reluctance to do that? Is it because it's become so sort of controversial about sort of mandatory vaccinations that we were talking about earlier and all the rest of it, that the government don't want to recognise that actually there has been a negative impact on a small number of people?
Or as Christopher said there, we were still rolling it out. They were wanting to make sure people were taking the vaccine. So does that add into maybe why they didn't want to pay people out?
Well, I think it probably does. And I think their attitude to this is actually going to backfire because instead of having paid these people off, at which point they become quiet, this is now getting a lot of attention. So I think that was a mistake on their part. But I think also, to be fair, for some conditions, it does take a long time to figure out that it was a vaccine-related problem. So if we look back to 2009 and the swine flu pandemic with Pandemrix, 2009 is when people were vaccinated. 2011 is when they first noted a problem with narcolepsy in Sweden and Finland. In 2013, Public Health England first said we had a problem. And still in 2020, they're saying actually it was more common than we thought. So you can see that, it could take a long time, although these days we've got much better big data systems in the NHS to be able to find these things out quicker than that.
And now, can I just do a comparison between our system in the UK and that in America? We have a very high threshold, and they don't. Why have we gone down two different routes?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question. There were quite a few differences. So in America, they take, there's a sort of tax on vaccines, if you like. There's a certain amount of money put into the pot for every vaccine given, which is then used for damage payments. And the way that these things are handled is almost a sort of no-fault system. If you've got the problem, they believe you as a baseline. And they pay out on the basis of lost earnings and of the cost of care, whereas we've got this flat rate scheme that really doesn't necessarily cover that at all. And I think part of the culture, there is a cultural difference with vaccination here and in the US. And part of it is to do with the pressure to get vaccinated. So I lived in the States for a while, and my four primary age children couldn't go to school until they'd had the full American course, which included 3 separate doses of hepatitis B vaccine, which meant, until we'd had that 3rd dose, they weren't in school, as if they were going to be shooting up in the corridors with their primary school classmates. I mean, it was such a different culture to here. And so, but obviously with COVID, that culture has changed here. And I think that needs to be taken into account.
And so with a 12 billion vaccine programme, you'd say, and it was more or less mandatory, or everybody felt compelled to do it, that there should have been, money put aside in the UK should there have been damages?
I think if you're going to spend £12 billion and vaccinate 52 million people, it would be naive not to have set aside some money for compensation.
Dr. Claire Craig, thank you very much indeed for joining us. It does seem extraordinary to me that people where the coroner said the cause of death was the vaccination, that those people still haven't been paid out. That does seem extraordinary to me.
Yeah. Coming up, we'll be finding out what you've got to say about all of today's top stories.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate.
From all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel.
Right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask. So why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood, and every weekday we bring you The Briefing live from 9:30 a.m. The stories, analysis, and live debate that you need to hear.
Quite right, Tom, of course.
Was this something that had been considered at all?
Difficult to answer.
Gas-guzzling helicopters circling. Noise is being made here. Joe Biden walking out. Thank you very much for joining us. Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, Monday to Friday, 9:30 a.m. on GB News.
Join me, Gloria De Piero, Monday to Thursday at noon for The Briefing. We go to the parts of Parliament that you won't see elsewhere. Plus, there's exclusive interviews with MPs from all parties.
But quite often, they paper over the real truth. Why does a working class lad like you join the Tories?
That's a good question.
Don't miss it, Monday to Thursdays at noon on GB News.
Welcome back. It's time to go through some of your GB views.
Pete says, if we could sort out these economic migrants coming through the channel, maybe we would have more resources for genuine refugees.
And Amika says, the UK is one of the most generous countries in Europe when it comes to help people fleeing persecution. However, we must be sure of the identity of those we allow into our country for security purposes.
And Mandy says, I think we cannot cope with bringing Ukraine people into the country. Our NHS is struggling, no social housing, and we already have homeless on the street, hungry and desperate for a roof over their head.
And I've got Richard saying, I have no problem with refugees from Ukraine, as most will return to their country. What I have a major problem with is illegal economic migrants.
And Trevor says, Joe Biden is a weak president and is one of the reasons Putin invaded Ukraine. If Trump was president, I doubt it would have happened.
And Anne says, if I had fled from Ukraine to Poland or any other bordering country with my children, leaving my husband or boyfriend, etc. behind, the last thing I'd want to do is drag my children even further away from their father. Well, thank you for those views. Keep them coming in. Still to come on today's Saturday Selection, we'll be taking a look at all those weekend's sporting events. But first, here's the news headlines.
Good morning. It's 11:31. I'm Olivia Guthrie in the GB newsroom. Russia is reportedly not observing an agreed temporary ceasefire in 2 areas of Ukraine. Authorities in Mariupol say fighting is taking place in the Zaporizhzhia region, which is where the humanitarian corridor ends. The Ukrainian government says they plan to evacuate around 200,000 people from Mariupol and 15,000 from Volnovakha. Prime Minister Boris Johnson says the Kremlin's actions are an abomination. President Volodymyr Zelensky welcomed the ceasefire.
Humanitarian corridors will work today in Mariupol and Volnovka to save people, especially women, children, elderly people, to provide those who will stay with food and medicine. Our aid is on the way. All who need help must have an opportunity to leave.
The Ministry of Defence says the rate of Russian air and artillery strikes in Ukraine has slowed in the last 24 hours. An intelligence briefing from the MOD reports Ukraine continues to hold on to the cities of Kharkiv, Cherniv and Mariupol. There's also been street fighting in Sumy, and authorities say it's highly likely all 4 cities are surrounded by Russian forces. Aid agencies are warning of a humanitarian disaster as food, water and medical supplies run short. A Formula One team has sacked its Russian driver following the country's invasion of Ukraine. Nikita Mazepin's contract has been terminated by the American-owned team Haas. It says he will not race in Formula One this season. The team also ended its deal with its Russian sponsor Uralkali, owned by Mr. Mazepin's father. Tributes are pouring in for the cricket star Shane Warne, who's died at the age of 52. Former England captain Nasser Hussain says he was outstanding and there will never be anyone like him again. The Australian leg spinner reportedly suffered a heart attack in Thailand. TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Now back to Saturday Selection.
As we heard in the news, the Formula One team, Haas, has taken the decision to ditch its Russian driver, Nikita Mazepin. We're joined in the studio by sports writer and broadcaster Aidan McGee. Aidan, I guess Haas didn't have a great deal of choice over this.
No, you have to feel sorry for him to some degree, Philip, but this is an example of where this story is moving so frantically as the days move on. You look at the start of the week, the FIA, the governing body in Formula One, said that the Russian competitors could race, continue racing, continue driving, but it had to be under a neutral flag. Now, that attracted a lot of criticism because you're saying, actually, you're just placating the Russian influence there, the Russian finance specifically. That's no different to what the IOC did. The IOC uncovered a campaign of state-sponsored doping within Russian athletics, and yet they were allowed to continue competing among this kind of hybrid solution, which was, you can compete under the auspices of the Russian Olympic Committee flag. And now, as if anyone would look at that and think those people aren't Russian or they're anything other than Russian, it was a nonsense. Obviously, with the war outbreak, it's intensified. The FIA were criticised, as I said, about that. And the chair of Motorsport UK, David Richards, CBE, actually took matters into his own hands and said that no Russian drivers will be allowed to compete in Formula One in the British Grand Prix. So that would be the Silverstone, which takes place, I think, on July the 3rd. So that kind of brought the issue to a head, into focus, and it almost forced the FIA's hand, really, to some degree, because they responded by ending their association with the Russian Grand Prix in Sochi, which is due to take place in September. And then we arrive at a situation, the microscope goes on to Haas, who've got the one Russian driver in the competition, and they have today severed their links with the driver himself. I'll read out the statement here. Haas F1 team, and this is released in the last couple of hours, has elected to terminate with immediate effect the title partnership with Uralkali and the driver partnership of Nikita Mazepin. As with the rest of the Formula One community, the team is shocked and saddened by the invasion of Ukraine and wishes for a swift and peaceful end to the conflict. Now, it's not it's easy and it's difficult in some ways, and I'll tell you why. Firstly, it's easy because you think, well, this guy isn't going to trouble the podium. So what if it had been someone really big like Lewis Hamilton? More of a decision to be made in that eventuality. Second point, I would say, is that the guy's dad sponsors the team effectively. He owns the company. He's an oligarch himself. So by kicking out Nikita Mazepan, they're also starving themselves for sponsorship. So they're kind of taking this decision easily, but their hand has been forced, there's no question about that.
And of course, the big sports news over the last 24 hours has been the death of Shane Warne, which has been a massive shock to... I mean, I'm a massive cricket fan, a huge shock. I mean, probably the best bowler that's ever played Test cricket, arguably, and a real character to boot as well. And, you know, I mean, I'm reeling from that news, to be honest.
Yeah, I was absolutely the same. I was sitting at home yesterday afternoon, I see it, and it's barely believable. And obviously you get the request to speak about it as well, and I was sort of in overdrive pretty quickly, and then you learn more about the man and more about the cricket as well, and you go back to the ball of the century back in... I mean, who bowls the ball of the century in your first Ashes Test?
Yeah, in the first ball.
First ball.
It was the first ball bowled in an Ashes series, and it was the best ball that's ever been bowled.
For those who haven't seen it, I mean, it almost defied biomechanics and physics, didn't it? I mean, he threw it and heading off to the right, and it hit the ground, or hit the crease rather, and just completely went the other direction. He's up against Mike Gatting, former England captain, no mean player himself. Initially, I mean, we were talking to a friend of mine, Steve Baker, in our production team. He was actually there that day at Old Trafford, and he said that initially it looked like it hit a stone or it hit a divot in the ground or something, and then it was the early days of Jumbotron big screens at stadiums, sports stadiums, and then the crowd, who had no time for Shane Warne even at this stage, because Australia were ritually beating us since '86, and then they realised it's actually just a spin that took it that direction. And there was a gasp, an audible gasp around the whole arena to say that was witnessing something absolutely outstanding. And that was the arrival that day of Shane Warne to the English cricket public.
The thing I loved about it is that Mike Gatting stood there for a few seconds as if, well, that ball can't have hit. That ball can't have hit the stumps. It must have been the wicket keepers knocked the bails off or something, because that ball can't. And he walked off to the pavilion just shaking his face, just shaking his head.
And from a sort of a different angle, because whilst I can appreciate that he's a great cricketer, I don't follow it that keenly. But we've been out with him.
On you.
Shame on me. We've been out with him sort of on a more personal sort of level. We're going racing with him. And what I have to say, it was with Liz Hurley, wasn't it, at the time as well? And what I have to say is, what a fun chap, what a great chap, what a welcoming, treated everybody wonderfully, but what a laugh. I mean, he was quite riotous, if I'm being honest. He really was, and held everybody's attention, but just what a nice guy. And that's how I'll remember him, as an outrageous, fun, loving guy.
I haven't covered a lot of cricket down the years, I have to confess, but I remember back in 2005, I was an agency reporter, very young, cutting my teeth. I was working for, I think, either one of the broadsheets, maybe the Sun, something like that, one of the tabloids. I needed an interview. I was there as an agency reporter, tried to make my name, and asked him if I could have a chat with him. And he said, I haven't got time, I'm afraid, I haven't got time. And I said, OK, and I'll leave it. This is like a big international star. And he goes, but I'm just about to jump in a cab. Do you fancy coming? Do you want to jump in the back? We'll do it then. I went, oh, well, if you're covering the fair, well, why not?
That's the guy I know. That's the guy I know.
Exactly. So extraordinary. But what a huge loss. And you think of those Australian talents and those personalities, that bravado that came out of Australia in the late 80s, Pat Rafter, Pat Cash in tennis. You're thinking of his contemporaries in cricket as well, obviously McGrath, War, Ricky Ponting, the captain, of course, Mark Bosnich in football, David Campese in rugby. They kind of flew in the face of English imperialism, didn't they? And they were something new and fresh to an English public.
A big weekend in the football, Manchester United against Manchester City. That could help determine the league title.
Oh, without question. I mean, he wouldn't have said that 3 or 4 weeks ago, but obviously with City slipping up the other week against Tottenham 2 weeks ago with a 3-2 home defeat, then you had Liverpool not been losing their games. They won the Carabao Cup last week on penalties, which I predicted, by the way.
Yeah. Oh, I don't think you I don't think you thought it'd be a 10-11 penalties with goalkeepers going. Nobody could have foreseen that.
I didn't think the final ball would end up in a different postcode either.
Yeah, I think my dad had to take a couple of days to recover from that. I did say to him, "You got value for money there, Dad." What a day!
Liverpool in action today, 5:30 against West Ham. Now, if they win that, they go to within 3 points. A lot of football to be played before City meets Liverpool at the Etihad on April the 9th, but it does lead itself into a title decider there, because I can't see Liverpool losing too many games. Obviously, City are a calibre side. They're not going to lose many either.
Aidan McGee, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you. Coming up, have you ventured back to your local cinema recently? Well, we'll be speaking to one man who thinks you definitely should.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate.
From all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel.
Right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask. So why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
One of the businesses hardest hit during the various lockdowns in the pandemic was our local cinemas. Whilst the big chains have big pockets, how did independent cinemas cope in the times that the doors were closed? And what are they doing now to entice cinema goers back to the flicks?
We can speak now to Tony Mundin, who runs a family-run chain of independent cinemas in the Northwest. Tony, firstly, how's business, and is the new Batman film worth going to see?
Well, Phil, I've not seen it myself, but I'm hearing very, very good things. So, yeah, I think it's definitely worth going to see. Business is good. You know, we're very happy. It's been a tough couple of years for a lot of people, and cinema's no different. But our feeling is that the demand is back. People are coming out of the houses, and they want to come back to the cinema, which is great news.
And there's been a flow of sort of blockbuster films, it seems to me, since we had the lockdown ended. We obviously started with James Bond, but we've also had Belfast and Death on the Nile, the Duke, and now Batman. Which have been the most popular amongst your customers?
Well, Bond was the gateway film to get people back into cinema. You know, with Bond, there are people who only come to cinema to see Bond. They've not been since the last one, but it was great. I mean, we were working with reduced capacities at the time, but I think we were pretty much full for pretty much every show to those reduced capacities. So that was great. And then, as you say, there was a steady stream of high quality films. You know, we had Dune that followed it. We had House of Gucci, which went down a storm. Of course, Spider-Man, you know, that's done all kinds of big numbers all around the world. And as you say, we're playing The Duke, which is Jim Broadbent. It's Helen Mirren. It's a true story. People are lapping it up, and you know that's great. And we've got Death on the Nile, with some really great stuff to come as well.
Tony, as I was whizzing to Wilmslow train station last night, I went past the Rex in Wilmslow and I saw the Batmobile outside. I saw Batman outside and I saw lots of people sort of gathering and walking over. So it's, what are you doing to get the customers back in there? Because it's more now than just sitting in front of a big screen.
You're absolutely right. I mean, we are doing everything that we can, and the Batmobile being outside the cinema yesterday was wonderful. You know, the hits on social media because of it have been great for us. But it's thing, we're dabbling with entertainment. You know, we're having gala nights. We had a masked ball for Death on the Nile, and we're doing pizza nights. And this is great because now with every film, we're kind of putting on a pizza night, and we're buying that pizza from restaurants in the town. So since we kind of got going again from Bond, we've spent £10,000 on pizzas in Wilmslow. You know, so that's sharing the success of the cinema in the wider business community, and everybody's benefiting from it. And that's what cinema does. It's a great driver. It brings people into town, makes them stay there, makes them spend their money. So, you know, it's working for everyone.
But Rex, the independent cinema there, has got, it's had a difficult history. You only brought it back to life, as it was, as a cinema a few years back. And I want to know why you got involved.
Well, it was December 2018 we opened it, and it was our fourth project. We have 4 of these cinemas, and all of them have had the same story. You know, they were built in the 30s. They were huge cinemas. I mean, the Rex had 800 seats in it, as did our other venues. They were absolutely ginormous. But there's been a cull over the years. So kind of the first one was maybe something between 1970 and the mid-80s, where the main screen was hived off. It was typically turned into a bingo hall or a nightclub or a restaurant, leaving the balcony screen. And that balcony screen would have had 200 or 300 seats in it. And then we've got involved and we've looked at it and said, well, actually, those 200 or 300 seats don't bring modern comfort levels. So we've taken those out, reduced the number, increased the leg room we can offer, put bigger, more comfortable seats in, and that's what people want. It's the luxury experience of going to a nice cinema. So, you know, if we look at overall capacity from when the cinemas were first built to where they are now, there's been 80-90% drop in the number of seats. But we think that's right now. I think we've got a sweet spot where we've got a viable business that people like coming to. There's a right number of people in there. You get to know individuals rather than, being anonymous. And we're getting a great response to it.
Do you know what films to choose and how do you get to see them?
Well, we get invited to previews and we get screeners. So the distributors will send us a preview screening we can watch on the TV, or we can go down to London and go to a cinema there, which we sometimes do. But more often than not, we kind of know, look, we know what's coming. We're going to play Top Gun. We don't need to go and see it. Top Gun is coming to our cinemas, so you wouldn't necessarily do that. What we did go and see as a preview was Phantom of the Open, because we didn't know what it was. So look out for this film because it's utterly brilliant. It's a true story. It's an unbelievable true story that centres around one man's desire to play in the British Open golf competition. And he manages to get in, and it's utterly, it beggars belief, and it's got Mark Rylance in it, and it's brilliant. So there was a film we knew nothing about, so we got on the train, went to have a look at it, and now we can't wait to put it on.
Tony, I will certainly be looking out for that one. I just wondered, obviously the big talk at the moment is cost of living and the cost of living crisis and the headwind of that. I just wondered, is that a big concern for you, that the sort of the discretionary spend of people going to the cinema might be something that, that goes for a burden once people get really heavily into a cost of living crisis?
It's an interesting thing, Phil. Cinema has always done well during recessions. Now, of course, this might be slightly different. It's a cost of living squeeze. We don't know how much it's going to hurt, but it is actually a relatively inexpensive, easily accessible luxury treat. So, yes, I anticipate there will be people who will say, well, you know what, we can't afford our cinema trip. But I think there will be many who will say, let's keep it going because it's important to have that luxury in your life. And, for 20 quid, 2 people can come and sit and watch a film and enjoy themselves for a couple of hours. So it's relatively inexpensive. So hopefully, we'll be able to keep the walls from the door and keep going with it.
Tony Mundin, thank you so much indeed for joining us this morning. Thank you. And to finish the show, as we always do, with a look at the week's showbiz news. And we're delighted to be joined in the studio by our showbiz correspondent, Selina Cherry. So, Selina, let's start with the shock news from down under. Neighbours this time. Neighbours has been cancelled.
Can you believe that? And I love Neighbours. I don't watch it anymore, I have to say, but I just like the comfort that it's on. Do you know what I mean? It's one of those ones from my childhood.
Yeah.
It's such a shame. It's been on since 1985, and it's nearly coming to 40 years, but, you know, it didn't quite make it. They don't have the funds anymore, basically. It's funded by Channel 5, and Channel 5 just don't have the funds to make it anymore, so it's going to have to come to an end.
I can't believe this. I mean, I used to... if my mum and dad could be watching, I'm going to have a terrible thing to admit here, but when I was at university, I used to watch Neighbours twice a day.
Yes, me too.
I used to watch the repeat. It used to be on at lunchtime.
I was a saddo like you.
Selina, thank you.
I'm sorry, but I did.
It was
I'd
on
watch it at lunchtime, and then you'd watch it later.
At tea time.
Yeah.
And you always miss something in the first one.
There was always something you missed, and you just had to see it again.
I can't believe that only Channel 5 wanted it. I thought it would be sold.
Well, they did do. They tried to do a big shout out, didn't they? Other people must want it, share the costs with us, but obviously
they did.
Everybody
it still has 1.2 million viewers, though. It's still got a lot of viewers, yeah. But it's just.
Did you have a crush on any of the characters?
Well, Jason Donovan, obviously.
And what
back in the day?
Were you Kylie?
No, I don't know that I did actually have a crush on Kylie, to be honest. But I did used to love watching Neighbours. It was absolutely terrific.
I know. I'm devastated about that.
Well, Selina, I'm with you.
Yeah.
I'm gutted.
I feel your pain.
I'm gutted. And I was looking in the paper today, which about a very positive story about Nikki Chapman.
Yeah, I love this story. And Nikki Chapman, she got diagnosed with a brain tumour in 2019. They managed to remove part of it, but couldn't because they said it was too dangerous to remove the rest. She was having treatment and she was being checked up on. And suddenly, miraculously, they've said that it's completely disappeared. Which is what we all want to hear when you've been told that you've got a tumour. So I'm really happy for her. I think it's a brilliant story, and it's a miracle, but I'm so glad this has happened for her.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? That, you know, to have I think they cut out part of the tumour, didn't they?
They cut out part of it, yeah.
And then the rest
couldn't
of it
do the rest because it was too dangerous, too close to certain places that they couldn't get to, and it would be something she would have had to have lived with. And she had a checkup. She was on set and got the phone call and could not believe it. She's absolutely gobsmacked. I mean, most people who have a tumour want to hear the doctors ring them and tell them this has completely disappeared. It doesn't happen. You know, so for that to happen to her, I think is amazing.
And why I think this fills most people with hope is because everybody's journey with cancer is different. There are these wonderful positive stories, and I think you can take hope from that. And again, an amazing woman in TV, and she was sort of at the start, wasn't she, of the music shows?
Pop Idol.
Exactly. Did you know her from there? Did you ever sort
I've never met her.
Because being a pop idol yourself.
Well, of course, darling. But I'd never met her, you know, and I've obviously seen her. I watched all those programmes, loved them all, and she's someone that I've watched on TV continuously over the years, and it was quite a sad story to hear. Anyone who goes through cancer, it's terrible, you know, and to hear that, I was really hoping that she'd be okay, and it's just such a brilliant story. I'm so happy.
But did those sort of shows inspire you to do music?
Oh, 100%. I mean, I was doing music anyway at the time, but just to watch people be able to, because it was very difficult to meet people in the industry to help you to get to where you needed to get to. So watching these shows when they first came out, helping ordinary people be able to get on stage and showcase themselves on TV, and people vote for them, and then they can actually have a career. And people that wouldn't usually be seen by Simon Cowell, people who wouldn't usually get their foot in the door in these record labels, were able to showcase themselves and make careers out of it, like Will Young, for instance. You know, I thought he was brilliant.
That's much needed good news. And then we also ought to mention the court case involving the Sugar Babes.
Yes. I don't know why this makes me laugh. I'm trying not to laugh about it. But Jade, who used to be in the Sugar Babes, former Sugar Babe, who then starred in the West End show Aladdin, is now suing Walt Disney for £200,000 because her co-star apparently was singing extremely loud, and she had to, you know, really sing over this guy during singing A Whole New World, and it strained her vocal cords, so she's now suing Walt Disney for £200,000.
I've never heard of a case like this before. Is this? I mean, I've never.
This is not an ordinary thing, but I'm now starting to think maybe I should have made up a few stories myself.
There's time.
When I
Selena, there's time.
When I sang with Lionel Richie in Italy, you know, he was over singing, so I need to, you know, get some money back for that. But yeah.
Well, you have to see how this case goes and then decide whether or not.
Well,
you're
exactly.
Put in a
claim. We can claim for anything nowadays.
Exactly.
It's funny.
Absolutely. Selena, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
It's been an absolute pleasure as always. Thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, and hopefully you'll be back with us next week and we'll talk more about showbiz and
Putting a claim in.
Putting a claim. Exactly. She'll be too busy. She won't be able to.
You guys are talking too loud for me, I'm afraid.
Well, that's all from us. We'll be back next week, Saturday, 10 o'clock, as always. Coming up after us here is Alistair Stewart and his friend. But here, it's time for the weather.
Good morning. I'm Alex Deakin with your latest weather update from the Met Office. The weekend promises quite a bit of sunshine for many of us, but a fairly dull and damp, dismal day across eastern England today, mostly thanks to this rather stubborn weather front that's been with us for a number of days. But high pressure is building in elsewhere. It's led to a pretty cold start with a frost for Scotland, Northern Ireland. But equally, plenty of sunshine to come here through the day. Just one or two scattered showers across the far north. That weather front, though, making for a dull, dismal, damp day from parts of Yorkshire down to East Anglia and the southeast, maybe at times also affecting the East Midlands. The West Midlands westwards, however, mostly dry and bright. Sunny skies for Wales, southwest England.